The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. The Lord said, "Woe to you who build the memorials of the prophets whom your fathers killed. Consequently, you bear witness and give consent to the deeds of your ancestors, for they killed them, and you do the building. Therefore the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles. Some of them they will kill and persecute, in order that this generation might be charged with the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel, the blood of Zechariah, who died between the altar and the temple building. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be charged with their blood. Woe to you, scholars of the law! You've taken away the key of knowledge. You yourselves did not enter, and you stopped those trying to enter." When Jesus left, the scribes and Pharisees began to act with hostility toward him and to interrogate him about many things, for they were plotting to catch him with something he might say. The Gospel of the Lord. I love the Lord because he is my Savior, and I fear the Lord because he is my judge. It's a famous quote from a Protestant theologian in the 20th century. I think it's very fitting for some of the readings we've been going through this week. We keep hearing Jesus talk about the woes and the judgments upon the people in Jerusalem who are not embracing his church or his message. I think it's important for us to remember this. And I'm not going to give a fire and brimstone sermon or anything like that, don't worry. But I do think it is significant for us to remember that Jesus is not only our Savior, he is also our judge. I think sometimes we as modern Christians, we love a certain idea of who Jesus is, or we love a certain image of who we want Jesus to be. It's important to remember who Jesus truly is. He is our Savior, but he is also our judge. I think part of the reason why we sometimes neglect this is, first of all, because of bad catechesis, bad preaching, but also it's something very key to the life of Jesus, which is often overlooked and I think misunderstood, especially by priests. I have to confess that in all my years of seminary, I never learned about this in any of my classes. Thank you to God, I found some great scholars who introduced me to these ideas, and especially when I began to study the book of Revelation towards the end of my seminary studies. And it's a little bit scary, it can be a little bit intimidating, but it's also really amazing to think that Jesus, in his ministry, not only preached mercy and not only died for us, he was truly a prophet. So one of the things you're going to hear me speak about in many different homilies is one of Jesus' most important prophecies that is almost entirely unknown amongst most Christians. What is that prophecy? Jesus in his ministry, he came to establish a church over and against the current religious establishment. And the people who fought against him the most were the people who were in charge of that religious establishment, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priest. And so Jesus, many times in his ministry, he warned them about what would happen if they didn't accept his message. Today and yesterday, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scholars of the law! Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees!" What does he mean by woe to you? It's not simply a warning that they need to change their ways. It's literally a warning about what will eventually come. The scribes and Pharisees of Jesus' day were not unique in salvation history. Today, in Jesus' words, he told the scribes and Pharisees that they would be found guilty of the blood of Abel, all the way to the blood of Zechariah, and all of the prophets who their ancestors had killed. Did you know that? That most of the prophets in the Old Testament were killed by the religious establishment of their days? For much of salvation history, the temple priests and ministers were corrupt. At some points, they even put idols in the sanctuary. And so many times the prophets were the ones rebuking them, warning them about what would happen if they didn't change their ways. And many of the prophets were martyred because of it. The prophet Isaiah, for example, as is mentioned in the letter to the Hebrews, he was sawed in half. He was martyred. Zechariah, who we heard about in the passage today, Zechariah lived just before the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC, and he rebuked the priests of the temple for putting idols in the sanctuary. And so they threw him out of the temple court and they stoned him. Zechariah. Many prophets of the Old Testament were martyrs because they rebuked the religious establishment. Jesus, in his ministry, does the same thing. And it's something that we don't think about or understand well enough most often. Jesus, in a certain sense, is the ultimate prophet. So again, a little Bible history, as I mentioned a couple times already. One of the things that happened to the people in Jerusalem who were unfaithful, who were a part of this corruption, is they lost everything. Remember what year they were taken into exile? Bible trivia? 587 BC. I want us all to remember that date. 587 BC. The people in Jerusalem were carried into exile and the temple was burned to the ground. Zechariah lived just before that time. It was almost like the last straw, the straw that broke the camel's back. And so the people in Jesus' day, when he speaks about the blood of Zechariah, they would have recalled that Jesus was warning them just as Zechariah had warned their ancestors. And here's the prophecy. Jesus, as he continues to talk in these gospel passages, at a certain point he starts giving this long extended homily about the destruction of Jerusalem and about how the temple would be destroyed again. It's in Matthew 24 and 25. It's in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 21. It's in the Gospel of Mark, Mark 13. And then Jesus ends that homily by saying, all of these things will take place before this generation passes away. All of these things will take place before this generation passes away. Many modern Christians, including Bible scholars, when they read that, they think Jesus is talking about the end of the world. And so they think, what on earth? He said that this generation wouldn't pass away until all these things pass away. And last time I checked, the world is still around. The end of the world hasn't happened yet. Jesus, in a Jewish way, was talking about the temple being destroyed. And in the Bible, how many years is a generation? Remember the generation in Israel? How long were they wandering in the desert? 40 years. Jesus, preaching around the year 30 AD, says that before this generation passes away, all these things will take place. 40 years after Jesus preached those words, the Romans came into Jerusalem and they destroyed everything, including the temple. Jesus' ultimate prophecy was in fact fulfilled. And interestingly enough, if you're with me so far, the book of Revelation, it's one of those keys that unlocks the book as well. The book of Revelation, in many ways, was also a prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. St. John had his vision on the island of Patmos just a couple of years before 70 AD. And in fact, an early church historian tells us about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He says that in that destruction there were over 1 million Jews in Jerusalem who were killed. But there was not one Christian who died in the siege. And the early church historian explains the reason why. He says that the Christians had fled the city. They fled to the mountain city of Pella because of a revelation. The vision John had, the book of Revelation. So we're going to keep talking about these things as they continue to come up in the scriptures, but I just think it's so fascinating, so interesting. But it should also be a bolster to our faith to truly see that Jesus was not just a preacher of some abstract message. He truly was a prophet. and his prophecies truly were fulfilled, and he deserves our obedience and our service, and he deserves our love as our Savior. But he also deserves some fear, because he's also our judge. Unlike the people of Jesus' day who did not fear him and rejected his message, and did not take care of the temple, did not take care of their church, it should inspire us to be more zealous for our church and for our parish.